two, 1, 2, 3.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Teresa Alt, I'm the host, and I'm here with Elan Shapiro, a community organizer, community educator, quite well known in this community, who recently attended the National Common Bound Conference. And I think this time, as socialists, we will be looking outside the box more than we usually do, something we should be doing more often. So, tell us about Common Bound.
Well, the Common Bound Conference is put on every 2 years by the New Economy Coalition, which consists of dozens and dozens of organizations across the country that are trying to build the pieces in a coherent way for what comes after capitalism. And what's so striking about the conference and about the coalition is that the elements of a post-capitalist economy already exist on the margins, and these groups are beginning to build up the scale and the effectiveness of these possibilities and to show how they can link up together into something that's coherent, that can truly replace, so we can really be resisting and replacing at the same time.
I was at Common Bound 2 years ago when it was in Buffalo and easier to get to. This year it was in St. Louis, quite far away. And it's a humongous conference with lots of tracks. In other words, you opt to follow a certain topic and you go from workshop to workshop to workshop. So what tracks did you follow?
Well, of the many tracks, such as financing the new economy, etc., I chose two. One was affordable housing because of how prominent and seemingly intractable the issue is in our community. And the other is arts and the new economy, because I'm very involved in developing slogans and memes and doodles that try to make it lively, fun, and attractive to envision the new economy. So I got fed in both areas.
Okay, well, I think both are interesting, but we will focus on affordable housing today, since that is a priority project of Ithaca DSA. And what exactly is the project that you were primarily following?
Well, there are a number of projects all around the country that had presenters that were giving very inspiring examples. There's the Push Buffalo project, which combines reclaiming land that it's about to get gentrified and turning it into affordable, zero-waste green housing that depends on training neighborhood people to become the green builders. There's projects in Oakland that are resisting gentrification through showing that you can have multiple funding sources, multiple cooperative stakeholders, and they have outcomes that not only create housing, but that create farming and other educational programs all combined. But the one that struck the most for me, there are projects in New York City that have recently gotten city government to create major support and funding for community land trusts that move housing out of the speculative economy into things that are permanently affordable. But the one that struck me the most was this project called Housing for All, which is an alliance of groups across the country that are committed to showing that housing should not be essentially a speculative commodity, a source of profit, but that everyone does best if housing becomes a source of community benefit, and that it is possible in our lifetime to move in that direction, even though the assumption is that you need market-based solutions all the time.
Was the precise name of that project Housing for All or Homes for All?
Homes for all.
Okay, I thought that was
And
important when you Google.
yes, Homes for All. And it's actually the Homes for All campaign is part of the Right to the City Alliance. And so I misnamed that. The Right to the City Alliance, which is across the whole country, has a particular Homes for All campaign. And part of that campaign was coming out with a report in March of 2018 that's called Communities Over Commodities. And this report synthesizes the work that's going on all over the country by this people in this alliance, and it shows in a very compelling way how it's possible to move towards a community-oriented view of housing that benefits all people.
Okay, and that is, I'll confess, the document, that report is the document that you recommended that I read and that I started reading, although 80 pages was more than I could handle in a few days.
It's dense,
It's fact-filled.
or shall we say it's rich.
Yes. And a big point that they make throughout that whole report from beginning to end is they lay out their 5 criteria for, I guess you might say, any attempt at an alternative solution to affordability.
Right, and one of the things that's striking about these criteria is some of them are obvious, like it has to be affordable for all, and it shows how you can get there. And it has to be permanently affordable, because lots of things that are affordable suddenly get turned around and become unaffordable. So already to think not about affordability but permanent affordability is a change in paradigm. But most important, they say, is democratic control, community control. That the only way to truly make it work is to make sure that the people who are the residents are involved in the decision making and the policy making around it, and that it's not in some distant hands of some nonprofit far away or some government agency, but that actually the agency is in the hands of the people who live there. I've covered 3 of the 5, and one of them is that it has to be healthy and sustainable, that properties that are insecure, that are owned by landlords who are in it just for the profit, or governmental agencies that are distant, often are neglected or unhealthy, and have a negative effect on people's health. So healthy and sustainable is one of the 5 key things. And the other one, of course, is inclusivity, that there's a long history of housing that excludes people of color, that excludes people with disabilities, that excludes people who have a history of being evicted or of incarceration. There's a long list of exclusions, and so if it's going to be a meaningful development, it has to take that into account and make sure that those exclusions are being prevented and compensated for. So it's a very lofty set of criteria.
It is, and I must say I have a little concern about the community control, even though you might say ideologically there's a, democratic socialists have a complete, reliance on democracy. When people are only living very temporarily in a place, it's kind of hard to become really involved. And I think if we think about this community, we're going to have to think about doing some things in ways that are suitable for people who are only here maybe on a 1-year master's degree, a 2-year postdoc,
Sure.
are transitional for many reasons.
Well, that brings up the whole question of what kind of decision-making power should renters have. We usually think of renters as transitory too, but part of that is because of how insecure the housing market is. So these are things that can be thought through. It can be that some people who are clearly there for a shorter period of time don't get to make decisions about major financial investments, but that they do get to have a say in things that are immediate quality of life. So those are workable issues. I face that in the Eco-Village where I live, where we have renters and we have owners. And how much of a say should a renter have? Well, they should have a say if someone's dog is keeping them awake all night, but maybe they might not have a say in major decisions about road improvement. So those are, workable.
Right. But when you don't face it head on, you sometimes come up with slightly weird situations. I remember this in the Ithaca Housing Authority, that's public housing, publicly, federally owned public housing. I was on the board for 4 years. There was this real disconnect between, at the one time, on the one hand, pursuing policies that encouraged people to take, to join, to run for elected office on a council and play a role in governance of the place, and on the other hand, we're urging people to try to get out as fast as possible. I think there was a definite need to sort those two values out and figure out how to deal with them both.
And I want to just mention that a lot of things that we assume are off the table, I learned are not at all off the table. For example, rent control, which is not a fundamental change in the for-profit or for-community system, was phased out of 33 states in the 1990s by a right-wing organization called ALEC. But there are states that are continuing to have rent control, and in some cases, advocates are making sure that it's built up instead of being phased out. So oftentimes, if you mention it in Ithaca, people say, oh no, that's not realistic, can't happen. Well, rent control is allowed in New York State, and there are places where people advocate for increasing it. And people think, well, Section 8 vouchers for low-income people, well, that's getting phased out by the federal government, but there are actually states and counties and cities that are taking up vouchers. People say, well, we already have community land trust through INHS in the city, but that's a tiny amount of the housing stock. And one of the prominent places in the country where a community land trust takes housing out of the speculative market is Burlington, Vermont, which is in the same scale as Ithaca, and where there's 2,800 housing units that are now no longer in the speculative land market, where their prices are carefully watched over so they don't become just an investment, but that they stay affordable. And that's in a nearby city that's almost the same size as us, 2,800 units. So there are many things that we sort of assume are off the table or no big deal that I learned are really up for grabs all over the country.
So those were the 5 criteria presented that the Homes for All project uses to evaluate any approach or any specific housing project. Community control, affordability, permanence, inclusivity, health, and sustainability. And I think further they take these criteria and take a look at the current private housing market, and what do they find?
The private housing market fails on every count. It makes housing very insecure. It makes it hard for people who are marginalized to unmarginalize themselves, and it doesn't really reward health and sustainability. So on almost every count, it's a failing system unless you happen to be the favored small minority.
And when it comes to public housing or private housing with public subsidies, does that fare much better?
Well, public housing has been under attack and in decline all around the country, but it's a measure that can be improved, again, as a transition, because ultimately there's greater power in residents having control over their own destiny than in it being managed through a government bureaucracy. But public housing, when it's properly done and accountable to communities, is still part of the package of what could be viable in housing for all. So the question is how to make it more accountable and how to put the pressure on so that people don't discount public housing as just it's not available anymore.
And actually one of our other members was reading a book that I think established that a lot of this so-called decline of public housing is a manufactured crisis. But that's for another day. And I think we can move from how we evaluate, according to Homes for All, to what some alternative approaches are. And as I recall, they came up with 4 alternative approaches to producing or preserving housing that would meet their criteria.
And I would say that those 4 are truly oriented towards replacing the market system with a community-based system. But that may seem to some like pie-in-the-sky utopian, except that they also include along the way many measures that are important transitions that begin to move things in that direction. So even though those 4 models, one might say, are extreme or they're, hard to achieve, there's many steps along the way, and when we get to the policy things, then it'll become clearer. There are many steps along the way that can move things in that direction.
So let's take up those 4. One was the limited equity cooperatives.
Right. So in the limited equity cooperatives, there's a number of different mechanisms to fund this cooperative model because it's supposed to be accessible to people who've been marginalized, who obviously don't have a lot of capital to start with. So it's important that they show a number of different funding mechanisms, but essentially in these cooperatives, of which there are a few hundred around the country, people are making the decisions about the development process, and ultimately that includes a cap on how much the prices can go up, so that these things are guaranteed not to suddenly become unaffordable. That's one of the key measures in them.
Yeah, I think we kind of skipped over maybe the essential, the most basic step. In such a cooperative, a person who wants to live there buys their unit.
Their share, right.
Their share. And I guess in some cases they might have the cash to buy it outright.
And in other cases, there are funding mechanisms. There's a fund, a low-income fund that's built into the CLT that allows, for example, in Burlington, Vermont, that project is so mature now that it generates $100 million a year in income from its various projects, and that a lot of that goes into a fund to make sure that new people who can't afford a 20% down payment, that there are down payment funds in a lot of these CLTs that make it possible to people to enter into it without having to have a big chunk of money. So there is a number of different strategies for how to make sure people can enter into buying their share.
And I mean, I think that further money comes because there are monthly maintenance fees,
Right.
which are affordable, at an
Correct.
affordable level, but nevertheless, you take all the people together and it adds up to a lot of money. And as you already said, a major feature is that then, if and when you eventually sell your share, or your heirs sell your share or something like that, it cannot be at a greatly raised price. Now, some people I know will jump in with the objection, but owning your home is the way in which you build your wealth. And this, now you have a system that has deprived the people who live there of a way to build their wealth. Well, of course, if they were renters, they wouldn't be building wealth either. But
And if they were marginalized, they wouldn't be about building wealth either. But it's an important question.
it's an important question. Frankly, I think simply we have to talk about alternative ways in which people can build wealth. And surely there are many reasonable investment options for people if they have some income to set aside that aren't tied to your housing.
But it's true that this is a paradigm shift from the American dream that we are inundated with. So it's not a small thing, because all of this stuff depends on public education, so that there's a shift in the pressure that's put on our legislators, so that we all develop the political will to do things differently. And to develop the political will, people have to have a radical imagination, a cultural shift. And that cultural shift has to include the idea that when you start investing in community rather than in your own wealth, the benefits that come for your own retirement needs are many. In other words, these community land trusts develop. They have education centers, recreation facilities, childcare services. They develop sets of services that are more robust than the kinds of bureaucratic social welfare things that governments provide. And they all have a very high value on neighbors sharing with each other. That's part of the education process. They all have an education component to them, because it takes time for people to learn how to make decisions together and how to function cooperatively with each other. So without the education component, you wouldn't really succeed in these projects. And so the net effect of that shift is that people develop what's called community capital or social capital, which doesn't necessarily replace money completely at this stage in our history, but is a very important component that people need to kind of realize. Like, the wealth that gets created by cooperative community is very substantial. At the same time, as you said, there are other ways to invest. There are community banks that are now beginning to invest funds in public benefit things. There are ways that local investment opportunities are beginning to open up more and more now, that can provide 8 and 10% interest rates that might not be the same as thinking, oh, I've got a few $100,000 that are going to happen when I sell this house.
Yeah.
But as you say, there's many different ways to invest.
Right. Well, we've been talking about some of the ramifications of people buying into limited equity cooperatives, which are an existing model in the United States. Another model that exists in the United States is the community land trust. And this one actually exists in Ithaca to some extent. And so perhaps you could talk about that model.
Well, just briefly, the community land trust separates out the investment in land and the investment in the house. So you actually don't own the land. The land is leased for 99 years. You are able to have a share in the cooperative of the house, and that share gives you the ability to do what you want to do with the house, but you are limited in how much you can raise the price when you sell the house. And it really, there's more control over the overall project by the nonprofit that's engaged in ownership of the land. But for all intents and purposes, people have a good amount of control over their house, except that there's a strong limit on how much it can be used for speculation and for price raising.
So once again, there's that question about finding alternative ways for people to develop wealth that isn't tied to their housing, which you might say is a different need. We spoke about 4 models, and well, I could just maybe briefly mention what the 2 others were. There's something called the tenement syndicate that has been done in Germany. There's something called mutual aid housing cooperatives in Latin America.
Especially Uruguay.
Aha, oh that's where, okay, I was wondering.
And by the way, these are all called marginal, but in Burlington, the CLT is 6%, 7% of the housing stock. In Uruguay, it's 6 or 7% of the housing stock. So that's marginal, but not tiny. That's many tens of thousands of homes and units. And that last one involves people actually being involved collectively in building their projects together. So they really are more invested in their projects.
I think one more big question involves where money for all this can come from. And there seem to be 2 major sources of money, one being taxation, public money, and one being, in a slightly different way, public banking. And you might mention what a public bank is.
Well, public banking is a bank is no longer designed for profit, it's designed for community benefit. On the state level, the most well-known one in the United States is in North Dakota, but there are now public banks being developed in localities. In fact, there's a project in the New Economy Coalition to have a public bank in New York City. But I want to mention that part of the cost of housing has to do with land, and there are a number of policies recommended in this report for how governments can be much more proactive in freeing up land for these kinds of developments.
Which is very important, but I think we have run out of time. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Teresa Ault. I've been talking with Ilan Shapiro. We will certainly have much more to cover in the future. We've been talking about housing and some new approaches to getting affordable housing.
Thank you.